Right, so now we go on to the second structure, and that's gender. So again, what are we looking at in terms of those established patterns, or what sociologists call the sexual division of labour? If we look at the public sphere, what do we find? About half of women work in the public sphere. In the 1960s, it was only 30%, so that's obviously a big change. Women as a group, though, earn about 85% of what men do as a group. It's because they do less overtime, they work more part-time in casual work, but it is considered as a group, they're paid less, even though there's formal rules for equal pay. In practice, as a group, they don't earn the same amount, and sometimes groups with equivalent skills aren't paid the same because it's seen as women's work. If we look at what work men and women are concentrated in, we find women in health, education and personal services, so that's the classic nurse, teacher, secretary. Now, of course, there's still plenty of scope there. There's still 30 or 40% of women who don't work in those areas, but you can see that those areas are female dominated, and conversely men in mining, manufacturing, agriculture and management. 70-30, well 90-10 in mining, but 70-30 elsewhere. Women make up about 43% of professionals, 71% of whom are teachers, and men are about 70% of businessmen and 70% of scientists, 94% of builders and engineers. So you can see there's a clear sexual division of labour. We could then look at, we could drill down more specifically. We could look at the fact that the number of parliamentarians is about a third women. The number of women on boards of directors is only tiny. So you can see there's a consistent pattern that the higher up the hierarchy you go, the less and less women you see. The domestic division of labour, or in the private sphere, we can look there at the work women do at home. Now, of course, for a long time that hasn't been regarded as work because it wasn't paid. But we just look at these sort of numbers through the life course, and it'd be interesting for you to think about what pattern you might expect here. But this is a life course diagram from Bittman and Pixley's book Juggling Time, and the idea is that we go through 5 life courses. So the black and the white are men and women, and so when we're living alone, so we both have left home, when they move in together, when you have a child, when you're retired, and then when you're living alone at the end of your life when your partner's passed away. So we have those 5 life stages, and at the start we can see that men do less housework than women, but not by a whole lot. So men looking at 5 or 6 hours, women 10. When they move in together, his drops by 2 hours to 5, and hers nearly doubles to 19. Then when they have their first child, his drops to 4, and hers goes over 20, probably 22 or 23. Then when they're retired, he's back to 7 or 8 hours like he did when he was living alone, but she's doing even more work, 27 hours, because he's now at home, and so she's looking after him. And then when they're retired and living alone again, they're both doing about 18 or nearly 20 hours each. So we can see how women do far more work. On average, I say women do about 3 times the housework that men do. So that's the domestic division of labour. We can look at that and think about that in terms of hours worked. People sometimes say to me, oh yes, but men are doing more paid work, so women do more unpaid work at home, as kind of balancing out the total amount of work, which would be fine if that's what was happening, but people are entitled to negotiate what they think of as equitable arrangements. But if you look here, you can see this is a map of men and women. Women are the top bar and men are the bottom one, and we can look at unpaid against the amount of hours they work against paid work. So if they're doing no paid work, men will do 20 hours of unpaid work, and as their weekly hours increase, it stays pretty much the same. When they start to work up to 10 hours a week, it drops maybe to 18 at home, and then it pretty much stays the same irrespective of how many hours of paid work they're doing. Women, on the other hand, are doing about 40 hours, but it stays, she's working 10 hours paid work a week, it drops to about 35. By the time she's working 20 hours, it's dropping down closer to 30. And then it's really only when it crosses the 30 barrier that really drops significantly. In other words, you're just running out of hours in a week. By the time you're doing 30 hours, then it starts to level out, 40 or 50 hours. She's still doing more than her partner, though. So how do we explain that? So the general label for those patterns is called sexism, and sexism is unfair discrimination on the basis of sex, whether that's law or religion or language, all sorts of ways that we can discriminate. It assumes that men are more competent based on some universal trait that they share, or perhaps it's biological, and we see that in patterns in classrooms where men are more likely to be called on in class, more likely to be responded to. We take the norm very often to be a masculine one or a male one. We find specialties in women's health but not in men's health because normal is assumed to be male and then the deviance is seen to be female. I'm sure all of us are aware of aspects of gender blindness where we don't see the way women are excluded and the sorts of prejudice that exists in all sorts of spheres. Well, common sense explanations attempt to explain and justify sexism by arguing that it's caused by biology, and we'll be talking a bit about that next week. So you hear that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. They're just from different planets. They've got some sort of fundamental difference, and that's what explains sexism. Liberal interpretations or explanations say that it's just a matter of prejudice, like the example we gave before where prejudice and stereotyping reinforce each other. Secondarily, when they look at history, they say these things will work themselves out at a time. It's a historical accident that there were unfair discrimination against women in the past and we should just let that work itself out over time. Or again, there are just natural differences that make men and women suited to different roles. And so we can fight for inequality within the framework, but there are just differences that make those sexist outcomes inevitable. How do sociologists explain it? Well, we make an important distinction, and we call gender a social construct, and we make an important distinction between sex and gender and sexuality. So sex is the biological part, the male and female, but we have to be careful to avoid these sort of binaries. There are degrees, even at the biological level, of being male or female. There are people who are hermaphrodites, who have ambiguous genitalia, and so even at the biological level it's not a straightforward continuum. Then there's gender, which is the social part, the part of the roles we play, and then we have a continuum of masculine and feminine and androgynous. But again, we want to avoid that binary thing, and we want to avoid the common sense notion how our society and our culture puts it, and that is that being male, having a male body, means you will naturally be masculine and express that in masculine ways, and that if you have a female body you will naturally be feminine and nurturant and caring, and you will also, in terms of sexuality, be heterosexual. So the two opposite, inverted commas, in opposite sexes. I mean, you have to ask yourself what exactly is opposite about them, but anyway, the opposites attract. But because we know that there are people who are attracted to people of a different sex, and a different and the same sex, and people are attracted to both. So it's well worth having a look at this Gender Identity Project video. I won't play it now, but have a look. It's interviews with people working with transgendered people and a range of sexualities in New York, and so we get to hear their voices, which is good. But it's the one of the key things is that continuum that they emphasise there, and we want to map them onto each other. So we want to say there are two sexes, there are two genders, and really one kind of sexuality. So it maps neatly onto each other. But we all know there are ranges of how masculine, how feminine, range of context and so on, how heterosexual, how homosexual one can be. So we need to be aware that there is those binaries and that continuum. And of course, men and women are different. This is Gail Rubin's quote in Bob Connell's book on gender. Men and women are of course different, but they are not as different as night and day, earth and sky, yin and yang, life and death. In fact, from the standpoint of nature, men and women are closer to each other than either is to anything else, like mountains, kangaroos or coconuts. Far from being an expression of natural differences, exclusive gender identity is the suppression of natural similarities. Oh, that was good. When we look to more structuralist explanations, then the patterns we've just described are institutionalised sexism. They're patriarchal. So those sexist patterns of behaviour and attitudes are institutionalised in different ways within the various institutions. So we can see in terms of work, there's a sexual division of labour. In terms of pay, there are differential pay rates. At home, in the domestic sphere, in the family, and at school, there are ways in which sexism plays out within those institutions. And that's called patriarchy. In general, patriarchy is where men as a group have more power and status than women as a group, and men make most of the significant decisions and benefit from those decisions. So that's the key sort of underlying structural explanation as to why you get those differences. Of course, not all men are powerful, and not all women are powerless. But particularly if you started to come back to that class question and think about it, how these two aspects of inequality might be thought about together, then women of equivalent social class have less power than men of an equivalent social class. And the theory that buttresses all of this are various kinds of feminism. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about feminism, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview. But before I do, just pause for a second and think about what the word feminism conjures up for you, what it is. How many of you would say you were feminist? And how many think women should be treated equally? Now, typically when I do this question in class, I find that very few people regard themselves as feminists. Very few women, there's predominantly women in my classes, think of themselves as feminists. But almost everybody thinks that women should be equal. So my question then to them all is, how are those two things different? Because feminism is about women's equality. It's a movement against the sort of sexism we just catalogued. It's an ideology opposed to sexist ideas and practices, and it's a theory and practice aimed at ending sexism. Historically, its key demands have been equal pay for work of equal value, childcare, the right to free 24-hour childcare, and the right to control one's own body. So the right to choose whether or not to have a child or not to have a child, and the end to violence. Now, commonly it's said that feminism has gone too far, so I always ask my students the question, well, there are the key demands that feminism has raised. In the past there were other demands, the right to vote, the right to an education, but these were the key demands of the 1970s feminist movement, which is what most people think of when the movement goes back 100 years, but the most recent wave of feminism. So ask yourself, of those, which of those do we have too much of now? There are lots of different kinds of feminism. The most common division is between liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, and radical feminism. So you need to know first cut at those three. So liberal feminism focuses on individuals and talks about reform and gradual change, and has brought about the sorts of changes that you'd all be familiar with: the equal pay legislation, anti-discrimination legislation, easier access to divorce, and so on. The radical feminists are the ones who coined the term patriarchy and see it as a more structural matter, and then Marxist feminists are those who have campaigned on the basis of class and argue that it's working class women that should be the focus, and I want to understand how that relates to the class structure. Socialist feminists are a bit of a mixture. They tend to combine ideas from radical and Marxist feminism, but as you can see, there are lots of different kinds of feminisms there. There's post-structuralist feminism, ecofeminism, looking at the relationship between women and nature. various kinds of third world feminism, black feminism. What they all have in common, though, is they're seeking upfront political action for change. They want increasing choices for both genders. I think that's important to remember. Remove the cultural norms that suggest that females are inferior. They want the elimination of sexual violence and essentially the right to self-determination for women. Now, none of those things are anti-male claims, unless you think of men as unless you think of men as inherently superior, or you think that men have an interest in keeping their partners away from increased choice and political change and sexual violence, that their wives and daughters, of course they have an interest in the elimination of sexual violence and having the women in their life as more autonomous. So we'll come back to the issue of feminism, and then we'll expand and explore it in different ways, but for our purposes I think that's enough for today, and we'll go on to race next.